interesting and an issue of mergers and acquisitions. Jude just put a sign up to urge you to ask questions. Me and Craig are going to talk for a maximum of 20 minutes, probably less actually. And we're going to be sort of talking through a paper that we've just written actually, and together. And we've sent out to you just today. Penn will have sent it to you. Some of you will have seen it. Hopefully have had a look. It's really short. It's a 2-minute read, but it captures what we think are the most important things to be thinking about around merger. So I'm going to open up and talk a bit, and then I'm going to hand over to Craig. As Jude said, between us, we've got a lot of mergers experience between us. We've led them as chief execs and chairs, and we've also advised on a lot of them as well. And so what we're saying today is mainly based on a decade or so at least of fairly heavy end M&A activity in the third sector specifically. And so we're going to just share what we think we've learned, what we think is valuable, and then hopefully open up into a really interesting conversation that Jude will facilitate, not me. So that's the plan. So I'm gonna just kick us off. So if you've got the paper with you, you might want to sort of look at it while I'm talking, or this will just work as a talk. So just let me walk us through. I think in these difficult times that we're in, it's going to quite likely happen that your organisation will either be approached about a merger, or you will seek possibly to be asked to take over a smaller organisation, or you might actually get an approach from a much larger organisation asking if you're interested in being acquired. We call this mergers and acquisitions, M&A. So that's the shorthand we're going to use today. Now, this doesn't happen all the time, and when it happens, we sometimes think, well, how do we make a judgment about this? How do we think about it? But this today is really about us really thinking about what we need to be thinking about if this happens. And we think there's 3 really important things to think about as you contemplate this. The first one is why? Why does it make sense? What's the strategic logic of doing this? What is the 1 + 1 = 17? Because if it doesn't add up to a big number, if 1 + 1 doesn't equal a significant number, then you're already at the margins of whether this is a good idea or not, and we'll explain that in a bit, why we think that. So we're looking for strategic logic. Well, what do we mean by strategic logic? Well, again, we mean one of a small number of things. Normally, when a merger or acquisition is on the table, you're looking for one of the following things. You're either looking for new capabilities. So here, the merger or acquisition, it'll deliver a kind of pooled set of skills or resources that together will create a much bigger impact. A really good example is one that Craig was involved in, and myself, where we merged 2 small charities, one called Coda Gojo, which I'll not ask you to remember, and Code Club, with a much larger organisation called the Raspberry Pi Foundation. And that made a whole load of sense, because Raspberry Pi Foundation, don't need to talk about who they are, but it enabled them to reach globally and create their offer on a global stage. Craig will come back to this in a bit, but there's a really big set of capabilities that the merger brought into existence. So number 1 is new capabilities. Number 2 is about market share, or in our sector, it's also market share, but it's being the dominant organisation. When you do a merger in our sector, what you're hoping to do, I think, is to create a much bigger beast, a much more effective and competitive organisation that can stand its own in a tough environment. So a really good example of one of those was my own merger that I led as a chief exec. I led the number 2 organisation in the sector I was in, which is called Speaking Up. Doesn't matter what it was called. And we merged with number 3, another organisation, to create a new number 1. And the point of that was that we needed to, in order to be successful in the sector we were in, which was the advocacy sector in mental health and learning disability, we had to create a dominant brand. And the only way to do that was to create a new organisation that was number 1, and a kind of undisputed number 1, basically. And that's what we did. And that enabled us then to go out to commissioners with, we had scores of contracts, loads of geographic coverage, loads of credibility, in that marketplace. We were number one, and that enabled us to win and win long term in that marketplace. It was a brilliant merger, very successful. The organisation hasn't been touched to this day. 10 years ago. The third motive, and it's more defensive, is survival. Some of you are not going to get through this. Some of you are going to need somebody bigger to come along to essentially rescue you, somebody with a bigger balance sheet, with more cash, with more assets. Some of you are going to have to rescue other people, possibly, because you might feel that's a good thing, or it might actually strengthen your organisation to do it. But so survival is an important motive in mergers. We see them all the time. This week, one of our members, the Brain Tumour Charity, has merged with us, well, has acquired essentially a smaller charity in that field with a long name that I can't remember. Again, that would have been about ensuring the offer for that small organisation continued, because otherwise they'd have probably run out of cash, is my guess. I don't know the details. But so you've got three big reasons. You've got creating new capabilities, you've got dominance of your market, and let's not be squeamish about that. We have to be big and dominant in the markets we're in. Otherwise, we're not going to be seen and we're not going to survive. And thirdly, if things are really difficult, there might be a survival play, and a merger might be the answer to that. So they're all big considerations in when you're thinking about a merger. So their rationale. So people always say, well, isn't the third sector a bit different? All this M&A talk, is that not all a bit corporate? Do we really want to dominate markets? Well, yes and no. I think our sector is, Penn's put the name up, which is the Meningioma UK charity, with Brain Tumour Charity. Thank you, Penn. Third sector mergers are a bit different in that companies don't buy each other in our sector in the same way. So in the company world, company A buys company B, and they pay a price for that, and the owners of company B, company A, swoop in. They might leave the owners of company A there, or they might fire them all, and then they invest in company A, company B, in order to make it succeed. And there's a purchase price, money changes hands, and there's a set criteria for whether you want to do the merger or not. Is it going to be a successful acquisition for you? Is this going to make money or not? In our sector, it's not quite so straightforward, because money doesn't change hands in the same way. Charity A doesn't buy Charity B, and the people involved are not getting money. So it's a bit more complicated. And in our experience, the biggest obstacles to mergers and acquisitions are actually normally the senior employees and trustees within the organisations involved, because for them, a merger can either be a threat to their income, or their status, or their role. So but because it's a charity, or because it's a social business, we're not really supposed to be talking about money, and that doesn't form part of the due diligence. It doesn't become part of the grown-up conversation about what we're really doing. And this is a big mistake, because successful third sector M&A needs to be treated a bit like a commercial transaction. Actually, there needs to be a proper deal for the people involved, the chief execs, the senior management teams, the trustees. They all need to be part of the deal, actually, we find, because if you don't attend to that, we tend to find the merger doesn't fly. So to give a personal example, when my charity merged with another one, there was a deal. The chief exec of one organisation, which was me, would stand down, and I would be compensated, and that was all part of it. There'd be a new name for the new organisation. The board would have a chair from our side, and the senior team would be picked on merit. Without all this being sorted out in quite a grown-up way, because we all had interests, I couldn't just leave a job without any guarantees. A deal was done, and that enabled the deal, the merger to happen. Yes, we all cared about impact. Yes, we all wanted the thing to succeed. But if you don't look after the people involved, it's not going to fly, because nobody's going to surrender their their income, their status, and so on. Everything has to be talked about just like it was a commercial deal. So they're just some things that I think are really important in this sector, in mergers. You've got to have a really strong rationale, and you've got to treat the people involved as though they were owners, basically, of the organisation, even though they're not. So they're the things I wanted to talk about. I'm going to hand over to Craig now. Craig's to talk about actually making this work, because that's the next thing. You do the deal, you've got to make it work. Craig, you know all about this better than me. Over to you.
Thanks, Craig. So you've got your strategic logic sorted out. You've got the two boards on side. You've agreed the new chief exec, the new chair, etc. The third consideration that we think is absolutely vital to a successful merger and acquisition is integration planning. So it's coming up with a really good plan and then making sure that that good plan is successfully implemented. And I'm sure many of you have heard the statistic that I think KPMG came up with from research they did a few years ago, that said that the reason that 80% of mergers and acquisitions failed to deliver the business case that was planned was actually due to poor quality post-merger integration. So the logic was there, but the integration was badly executed. And what can happen in that case, and I've had experience of that, is you get a new organization that is less than the sum of the parts of the two merger organizations. And that can lead to a sense of drift, a slow, messy integration that can be expensive, can last many years, and can cause quite a lot of confusion to staff, to funders, to beneficiaries, and to wider stakeholders. So if you get it wrong, it's really quite painful. And most mergers do go wrong. So we think there are three factors that you can take as leaders that will maximize the chances of a merger or acquisition being successful related to integration. So the first action we recommend is make sure that you've got a dedicated team of senior executives of both of the original organizations who come together and who are tasked to come up with a plan and to oversee the delivery of that plan to make sure the integration is well handled. And that should cover everything from changes to the org structure, changes to back office, where often there'll be quite a lot of cost savings, changes to systems, financial systems, CRM systems, even looking at things like expenses policies. In fact, often I've found expenses policies as one of the most contentious issues when you have mergers. So having that dedicated team, and that can feel like quite a big investment, because ideally these people will be freed from most of their day-to-day operational responsibilities, so that they can really make sure that for the first year the merger is really properly bedded in. But I think that investment is well worth it, because you will then really get the fruits of the merger. The second thing is to make sure that you have a very, very clear communication of the vision and strategy and the logic of the merger that is communicated to all of the stakeholders. So obviously staff, but volunteers too. I think often volunteers and the wider communities are overlooked. Funders, service users, commissioners, funders, etc. And I think it's important that that communication is, you keep communicating, you keep coming back to the logic, and you make it high level, but also with some good practical elements to it, so it's not too broad. So for example, Raspberry Pi is an organisation that is focused on helping children around the world learn to code. And originally it was all about creating content, online content, lesson plans, if you like. And then it merged a few years ago with a charity called Code Club, which runs school-based clubs, schools and libraries, for children to go in and use content to learn to code. And a couple of years after that merger, it merged with another charity based in Ireland called Coder Dojo. And what we found was that we were probably a bit too slow to be really clear on what was the strategic logic of the second merger, because it was a second coding network, and there was quite a lot of overlap between the two coding networks in terms of country geography. Some countries, they were both very strong. There was a bit of confusion from some of the distribution networks. So libraries, for instance, we'd get librarians coming up and saying, should I start a code club or should I do a Coder Dojo? I'm familiar with both. And in hindsight, we felt that we should have been clearer earlier on about which brands we think should be mapped to which channels and which countries and even which funders. And that level of practical detail was actually really welcomed when we got there by our various stakeholders. So be really clear on the communication. And the third thing is making sure that there's a really good, strong emphasis on culture. You're bringing together two organisations here, and perhaps you think the mission is quite similar, but the underpinning norms and the culture and the values of those organisations will have significant differences. And sometimes it's quite hard to spot those and to understand them until you are one organisation. And I think it's about building trust quickly. And I think it's about leaders of both organisations coming together and really taking the time to listen regularly in person with staff of the new organisations, and understanding the nuances of the culture and inspiring people to move out of their comfort zones and move on from accepted ways of doing things, accepted norms, embrace the new way of doing things and make that successful. So I think that's incredibly important. So going back to the example at Raspberry Pi, Code Club was actually quite a straightforward merger because Code Club had a very similar culture to the Raspberry Pi Foundation. It was pretty centralized, it loved systems and processes, and it was pretty top down. Coder Dojo was much more freewheeling, much more entrepreneurial, much more grassroots led, not a big fan of systems and processes. So actually, we didn't really realize that until we'd done the merger. So we had to put a lot of effort as a leadership team to really make sure that the new culture for the new, bigger and better organization embraced everyone, and that we took the best elements of the culture of all three organizations. So in summary, we think there's an awful lot of effort that you need to do up front, but that effort is well worth it and it will pay off. And the costs of not making that investment are way too high, given that most mergers do fail. So if you want to go ahead and do a merger, make sure that that strategic logic is so compelling that it's well worth the investment that you absolutely will need to make. Craig, any more comments before we open up for questions?
I think we should open it now, Craig. Thank you.